please take a seat. Enjoy, get comfortable, relax. I was so incredibly blessed. Sometime in the fall, a good friend of mine who is also a pastor, she's a Lutheran pastor. And for 2 years, they had been planning at her church and a couple of other affiliated Lutheran churches to do a Land of Luther tour. Apparently it's a thing, and I was unaware of this. And through some different circumstances and a very, very kind of sad, unfortunate accident, she and her husband, who was also a pastor, they were supposed to be leading this tour. And he was actually part of the Seattle Search and Rescue. So you know when people get stuck on mountains and somebody has to go get them? He was the guy who went and got them. Only his Garmin was off, and while he was on a training mission, he ended up falling and coming to his death. So they don't have children, both in ministry, and they had been planning this trip. Actually, they'd been planning it for about 3 years. It was supposed to happen in 2020. And we all know what happened in 2020. COVID came along and upended the world. And so we were talking, and she said, I still really want to honor doing this trip. I don't think I can do it on my own. Because she was leading a group of about 30 people from their 2 churches to be able to go to the Land of Luther. And so I got asked to be the extra clergy to come alongside. And so it's this incredible opportunity for a very sad reason. But so I just have returned from hanging out in Germany for 2 weeks with some of my new best friends who are all retired. We got to begin in Berlin, went all the way to Salzburg, and went up to a town called Oberammergau. And it was incredible. I have never had an experience like that. When I talk with people about travel, I have been blessed to travel quite a bit, but it's always because I'm building a house somewhere, digging a well, doing a VBS in some other country so somebody else can dig a well. And so the idea of just going to travel for travel, I didn't totally know what to do with. It was amazing. There was running water everywhere. And there's a thing called portage. Some of you may know what that is. Like somebody else carries your suitcase off the bus. It was amazing. So I had this incredible experience. But one of the best things that we had was a brilliant tour guide who took us around. And so as we began in Berlin, I know the stories of Berlin. I've read, I went to school. I know there was East and West Germany. I know there's East and West Berlin. But what I did not fully comprehend is, in my head, there's this wall that they'd had. We knew there was going to be a memorial. And I'm sure I heard it someplace, maybe I was just a bad student, but there was an inner wall and an outer wall in this section. Now, some of you are like, yeah, we paid attention in school. Or you were teaching it, quite frankly. You are better than I am. I got there and went, oh my gosh, there were like 2 walls here in Berlin, but they've got kind of memorials everywhere to this. And then they have pictures up of what it looked like prior to the division. And it was parks, and it was incredible buildings, and it was gorgeous. And then they have pictures of what it looked like when the walls were up. And they showed literally the tanks and the construction equipment that became destruction equipment, where they just knocked down entire sections to create what was called either the no man's zone or the dead man's zone. And it was roughly the length of a football field between one wall to the next. And the idea was if you were trying to escape East Berlin, you would climb over that wall, have to run that now barren section to then get up over the other wall with guards all along, so there was nowhere to hide. And I was so struck by how stark, how empty, how barren, but compared to these pictures prior to that, how gorgeous it had been. But realize I'm still looking at both of those as pictures, and then we're actually standing in the space where they said, oh, by the way, you're standing exactly where those pictures took place. And I thought, there is no way. It's only been 30 years. Only 30 years since that wall came down. And when you look around in that area right now, it's back to being parks. and incredible trees. And they have these amazing trees that are called horse chestnut trees. Do any of you know this tree? Some of you do. I was like, why have I never heard of this? There were white ones and pink ones everywhere. And it was spring, so there were flowers everywhere. It was breathtaking. Just like walking outside was this magical kind of experience. And as I was there, I kept thinking, what an interesting place to be, where there now are buildings and vibrancy and life and kids playing and people riding bikes. And there were pictures of it when it was full of life and pictures of it when it was barren. And now it is back to this space of being full of life. And I kept thinking, what a great picture of this beautiful space that God has created that gets defiled, that gets ruined and destroyed. And I can only imagine, in kind of the 50s and 60s, and certainly into the 70s, where, the wall came down in '89. So there was this space that people recalled being beautiful, but had been so destroyed, and how despondent they must have been, going, it's never going to be good again. It's never going to be okay. It's never going to be beautiful. And yet I'm standing there going, I can't imagine when this wasn't beautiful. I see the pictures, but it's hard to believe. And I have that in the back of my mind because I've just returned as I'm reading through this text. And so there are a couple of things from each of the texts today that I want to touch on. The first one was from Psalm 97, and it's that first line that says, God, you are sovereign. I don't know about you, but that's a really hard thing to hear this week. Repeatedly, as people are holding vigils, and in particular in Uvalde, where I'm hearing about a church service last night where they're memorializing the 21 people who were murdered. And the words at a church service are, God, where are you? We don't see you in this. And the sorrow and the heartache and the frustration that is there. And I think, God, you're sovereign? Are you kidding me? This is in the lectionary this week? And I'm so grateful for things like the lectionary. It was a previous conversation with Bishop Smith, and he and I were talking at one point in time, and we were talking about the lectionary and how sometimes we should veer from it if there's something that's happened in the world, and sometimes we really need to stick to it because as clergy, we may not have processed well yet. And so I'm telling you now, this week I leaned into the lectionary because I thought, I'm still processing. I don't know what to do with what has been happening any more than some of you do. But what I do know is that we serve the same God today that has been here yesterday and will be here tomorrow. And so when it says God is sovereign, what do I do with that? So I think about kind of what does this look like and what does this mean? And theologically, there are a couple of ways to understand sovereignty. Now, I know this is St. Peter's Episcopal Church, and I know sovereignty is the land of Presbyterians, but we're going to talk about it anyway. So, sovereignty, theologically, there are a couple of ways to understand this, and part of it, you have to set it in the context of all of Scripture. So there are two ways to think about it. There's de jure and de facto. Big fancy words that come in thick theology books. And one says the sovereignty of de jure. It's when people are like, oh, look, the Lord provided this parking space for me. I don't think God cares where you park, just in case you were wondering. I mean, it's a nice bonus when you get a good one. But I don't think that creator of the universe is like, how do I order things so that you have the right parking space? And I say that fully well knowing that in Psalm it talks about that he knows the very number of hairs on our head. So I'm like, God, you're always defying my logic. It's terribly annoying. But so this idea of de jure, of the day, any regular kind of thing, we also know that we live in a sinful and broken world, and there are things that are happening constantly that are not of God. There is nothing within me that thinks God would, why, yes, I think this shooting would be a good idea in order to bring me glory. That is a sick God that does not exist. And so, God, whose heart is breaking equally, if not more, with each of us as we struggle. I could name a whole bunch of other things that have been happening in the last 2 weeks, but I think if we just only talk about the shootings, that's probably more than enough. And I want to be sensitive that for some of you, there have been other things going on, whether it's finances or family or health, that are also making you question and wonder, God, where are you? How does this happen? Well, the other way to understand sovereignty, it's called de facto. So it's another kind of big picture thing, but de facto means that at the end of the day, God is sovereign. We know the end of the story. I'm looking around the room. I'm guessing most of you have flipped to the last chapter at some point in time. We know God wins, but we know there's a lot of battles lost on the way. And we are in the middle of losing some of those battles, but please take heart and take hope that God indeed does win in the end, and that it's okay to be sad, that it's okay to be frustrated, that it's okay to be angry. So that's one piece, that Psalm 97 piece. Then we get to the story. It's Paul and Silas. Again, this is a story that I'm guessing is fairly familiar for some of you. You've read it. You may have acted this out when you were a kid. You probably taught it at some point in time. And let me set it in context for you. So this is Paul's third missionary journey. So let's just do a little, kind of logic here. If he's on his third journey, is he a brand new Christian or is he kind of seasoned at this point? He's seasoned. He is not new to this. Brand new Christians are lovely, and sometimes they're super annoying to be around because they're like, did you know this? You should also. What are you saying? What are you listening to? I work with teenagers a lot. I always love brand new teenage Christians because they're like, you need to get rid of all music that isn't glorifying to God. And I'm like, well, since music can't be saved, but people can, I think there's music that's probably not good for us to be listening to, but I'm not going to throw out every playlist I have that doesn't say the name Jesus, because if we did that, Amazing Grace can't even be in my playlist. So, you're going to have to think about that for a moment. But yeah, Amazing Grace doesn't have the name Jesus in it, but it's a great song. So Paul is seasoned. He believes deeply, and he's still pretty human. Remember, he was kind of a jerk. He used to run around killing people. His base personality has not changed, although his beliefs have. And so he's on this third missionary journey. He gets to Philippi. For those of you who are going, okay, and you vaguely remember maps at some point when you were a kid, Philippi is in northeast Greece. So, or at least the remnants of it are now. It's no longer a town, but it was an important Roman city at the time, and for those of you who are budding archaeologists, you can go visit the ruins of Philippi, still there. So northeast Greece, it's the first time Paul is entering Europe, what we today know as Europe. And as he's there that initial time, there's a gate at the city, because that's how cities worked. There was a wall around Philippi, and then there's a gate. And the gate is both symbolic and pragmatic. Gates in cities were there for protection, they were there for the exchange of ideas, and they were there for the exchange of goods. But in Philippi, this gate was just open. People could come and go and come and go. And why this mattered is because it was a city that would have been considered to be safe. It didn't matter what your background was as you were in trade. You could show up. What it says, I promise, we're getting to chapter 16, and this isn't going to take forever. I'm not going to go through every detail, but I think the setup is important. Just before we get to Paul and Silas being imprisoned, we have to figure out what on earth is going on. Paul gets to Philippi. He's there, and they go out of the city gate unimpeded to pray, and they find a bunch of women. Now, this is striking as well, because it meant women were able to come and go. It meant that women were valued in a different way in that era. And one of the women he meets there is Lydia. Now, you may already know this story, but we don't usually tie it just before, unless somebody's putting this all in context for you. This is the conversion of Lydia. What it says is that Paul is talking to the women. He's talking, in the description of it, is as a rabbi talks with those who are learning. And so the women are sitting at the feet of Paul, listening to his teaching, and Lydia is converted. first European convert is a woman. Paul goes back into the city, and he's just quietly trying to do his thing. And it's as he's sharing the story of Jesus and the gospel, there comes a girl, a slave girl, is the way she's described in Scripture. And she's like, you are talking of the Most High. You are talking about God. And he's like, please go away. I'm just trying to do good here. And she keeps calling it out and calling it out. And he's like, I'm really going to get in trouble soon, because while the gates are open, the powers that be don't like to be disrupted. And so ultimately, and I love what it actually says in Scripture when you look at kind of that word, it really says, it's not like Paul was moved to compassion because she was possessed by a demon. It actually says he gets annoyed. So he's like, okay, seriously, demon, get out of her. You're on my last nerve. You've been following me and obstructing me and annoying me. I need you to be healed, so you'll shut up. It's not a very compassionate, friendly thing that Paul does. Remember, he's still got that same personality. She is, but that means that there are people in power who are losing money. So they create charges against Paul and Silas. And those charges that they create are really about somebody losing power and losing money. Paul and Silas go to prison. They sing while they're in prison. Like, I was always taught this story like they had linked elbows and they were singing Kumbaya, and they were like, oh, we're good. We can just be wherever we want to be. But remember, Paul is seasoned at this point. He's been beaten. He's been shipwrecked. He's been lied about. He knows what he's facing at this point. He's like, listen, you can't shake my faith. Imprison me, don't imprison me. I'm not going to change who I am. My circumstances, as bad as they may look, I know who I am and I know who I serve. The earthquake comes. The jailer is concerned that everybody's going to disappear. And Paul, without seeing him, says, don't harm yourself. I know what it is when you're afraid of the powers that be, but you don't have to be afraid anymore. Don't harm yourself. And the jailer is pretty freaked out. So he comes in and says, you're here. What must I do to be saved? So if that's the only thing you really hear from this morning is that jailer's question, he's asking, oh my goodness, when my bosses, the people who are powerful here, realize he's a part of a system that oppresses others, but he also recognizes that if he doesn't toe the party line, he's going to be in trouble. He's asking a question about the now, but when Paul responds, it's about the not yet. That jailer is saying, what do I need to be saved? How do I not get in trouble with the people who are my supervisors? How do I not end up in jail like you? And Paul's like, oh, I got this. But it's not about how do you not get in trouble now. It's about what does it look like for you for all of eternity. And so let me put a pin there, and we're going to go to the gospel reading that begins, and Jesus says, oh, dear disciples, let me pray for you. And I want to be really, really, really careful because we've had a pretty rough week in this country. And I'm guessing some of you have seen some of the conversation that people are sick of thoughts and prayers. In fact, what I have seen repeatedly are Christians saying, we need to forget this thought and prayer thing. Well, I think what a beautiful way for the enemy to come after us, to have us infighting in the church, where somebody says, I'm going to pray for them, and somebody else says, prayers aren't enough, that's garbage. So let's go back to understanding prayer. Sometimes prayer looks a lot like being very quiet and crying out to God and speaking and kind of maybe the traditional ways we think about prayer on a kneeler and being able to talk with God. That's what Jesus models for us. But Jesus also models for us kind of what St. Francis of Assisi shows, where he says, pray at all times, if necessary, use words. Jesus offers food to people. Jesus offers comfort to people. Jesus stands up to the authorities. And I would argue that all of those are also ways to be able to communicate the gospel and to be coming alongside others. And so this week, as we are still reeling from gun violence, this week, as we know there are families who are facing their first Sabbath without their kids, may we remember that not only do we have the privilege as Christians to be able to cry out to God for comfort for them, but we also have the ability to be able to live out our prayers in different ways. And instead of pitting against one another, maybe we need to recognize that for some people, picking up the phone and calling a senator or a representative is a way to pray. For others, going to a protest or going to a call to action is a way to pray. For some, it's being able to talk about the details. I don't know if you know this, but since January 1st, 2022, we've had 216 mass shootings in the United States. 216. Now, they don't all make the news, and if you didn't know, a mass shooting gets counted as something where at least 4 people were killed at one time. That's the definition of a mass shooting. That doesn't count so many of the other things that have been happening. But for some of us, prayer is indeed this powerful place of being able to intercede, being able to cry out. So I'm going to ask you, dear church, if you are that kind of person and that personality and who God's created you to be able to be putting kind of action to what you are doing, and action in the sense of calling someone or going somewhere, please do so. But recognize that those who are going to hold still and who are going to intercede are doing just as much work, because prayer is action. And we don't do what we do apart from prayer. And I am that kind of person who does make phone calls, who will go. Jameis Sandoval and I took a handful of youth on Wednesday night, the day after, down to the Capitol, and we stayed at a prayer vigil and listened to House of Representatives speakers talking about what do we need to do here in the state of Arizona to be able to address this. Now, I can't do that if I don't have some of you at home on your knees crying out to God. And if we as the church don't believe that prayer matters, then we've got a lot more Bible study to do, and we've got a lot more reckoning with who we are and the power of God. And so let's own what is good about how the Lord has created us, but let's not limit that, or let's not pit against one another. When the jailer asks, "What must I do to be saved?" Paul says, "Oh, Jesus offers the way." It's not just about the words you say, it's about the way you live. So may we be people who live in a way that preaches and shares the gospel. Amen.